year was 1868, and the air in the industrial heart of England was a thick, yellow shroud of coal smoke, steam, and the heavy scent of iron. In the town of Crawley, just outside the reach of London's sprawling shadow, the twin assassins Jacob and Evie Frye stood atop a high cooling tower. The air at this height was cold and bit at their skin, carrying the rhythmic thud of massive piston pumps and the shrill whistles of the ironworks. Below them, the world was a machine of soot and fire. Jacob, the younger twin by moments, adjusted his flat cap, his eyes fixed on the local Templar laboratory. The air around him was full of his restless energy, a desire to break the gears of the system with his bare hands. Beside him, Evie stood perfectly still, her breath steady and her mind calculating the path of least resistance. The air between them was a familiar blend of sibling rivalry and a shared, deep-seated purpose. Their father, Evie Frye, had raised them in the strict traditions of the Brotherhood, but the air of their childhood had been one of restraint and hidden lessons. Now that he was gone, the twins felt the pull of the great city to the north. The air in London was reported to be a toxic mix of Templar control and industrial greed, presided over by Grand Master Crawford Starrick. Evie looked at the letter in her hand, the paper smelling of old ink and the faint, metallic scent of the precursor artifacts she sought to protect. She believed the air of London held the key to a piece of Eden, a shroud that could heal any wound. Jacob, however, cared little for ghost stories or ancient relics. He wanted to build a gang, a force of the people to reclaim the streets from the Templar-backed blighters. The air was ripe for a revolution, and the twins knew that staying in the quiet countryside was no longer an option. Before they could leave for the capital, they had one final task in Crawley. A Templar named Rupert Ferris was running a factory that squeezed the life out of its workers, the air inside the plant thick with cotton dust and the smell of hot machine oil. Jacob took the lead, slipping into the facility through a high ventilation duct. The air inside was stifling, vibrating with the roar of the looms and the desperate coughing of the child laborers. Jacob moved through the rafters, his hidden blade a cold weight on his wrist. He saw Ferris standing on a raised platform, his voice a sharp bark over the din of the machinery. The air around the man was one of absolute, unearned authority. Jacob dropped from the shadows, the air whistling past his ears, and ended the man's grip on the town with a single, swift strike. As Ferris fell, he whispered of the greatness of London, his voice a dying rasp in the heavy air of the factory floor. While Jacob dealt with Ferris, Evie infiltrated a nearby train yard to intercept a Templar shipment. The air among the idling locomotives was heavy with the smell of grease, coal, and the white plumes of escaping steam. She moved with a silence that made the air feel as though it weren't moving at all. She discovered that the Templars were transporting more than just steel. They were moving a shard of Eden toward London. The air in the transport carriage was cold and carried a strange, electric hum that made the hair on her arms stand up. She secured the artifact, The train began to move, the air rushing through the open doors as the iron wheels ground against the tracks. She climbed to the roof, the wind whipping her hair as she fought off the guards. The air was filled with the sparks of the locomotive and the scent of burning wood as she eventually decoupled the cars, leaving the Templars stranded in the dark. The twins met at the edge of the town as the sun began to set, casting a long orange glow over the industrial landscape. The air was cooling, smelling of the damp grass and the distant soot of the factories. They boarded a train headed for London, the air in the passenger carriage smelling of stale tobacco and the wet wool of the travelers. As they watched the countryside disappear into the night, the air felt charged with the magnitude of their decision. They were going into the heart of the enemy's lair, a city where the assassins had been all but wiped out. Jacob cleaned his brass knuckles, the metal clicking softly, while Evie studied a map of the London boroughs. The air was full of the quiet, steady rhythm of the train, a mechanical heartbeat that was carrying them toward their destiny. As the train crossed the bridge into the city, the air changed completely. It became a heavy, oppressive fog that tasted of ash and chemicals. London was a forest of stone and iron, its streets a labyrinth of gaslight and shadows. The air was filled with a cacophony of sound, the clatter of hansom cabs, the shouts of newsboys, and the distant, deep tolling of Big Ben. Jacob took a deep breath, the air filling his lungs with the grime of the metropolis. He saw the potential for a new kind of brotherhood in the alleys and the pubs. Evie looked up at the towering spires of the cathedrals and the government buildings, the air on the heights carrying the secrets of the ancients. They were strangers in a vast, indifferent city, but the air of London was about to be stirred by the wings of the eagle. They arrived at the station, the air thick with the smell of fish from the nearby markets and the damp rot of the river. They were met by Henry Green, a quiet man who was the last remaining assassin in the city. The air in Henry's small shop in Whitechapel was a welcome relief, smelling of old paper, spices, and the oil used to maintain the hidden blades. Henry spoke of the terror of Crawford Starrick, a man whose influence reached into every bank, factory, and police station in the capital. The air in the room grew heavy as Henry described the fall of the London Brotherhood. Jacob and Evie listened, the air around them still and focused. They realized that to save the city, they would have to tear down the entire structure of the Templars' world, piece by piece. Jacob spent the first night walking the streets of Whitechapel, the air smelling of cheap ale and the wood smoke of the slums. He saw the blighters bullying the locals, their presence a poison in the air. He stepped into a crowded tavern, the air inside hot and smelling of unwashed bodies and sour mash. He didn't use his blade, he used his fists, showing the people that the Templars were not invincible. The air in the tavern was suddenly filled with the cheers of the downtrodden. Jacob felt the first stirrings of his gang, the Rooks, taking shape in the shadows. He knew that the air of London would soon belong to the people, and he was ready to lead the charge. Evie remained in the shop, the air quiet as she began to decrypt the notes Henry had collected. She found references to a hidden vault beneath the city, a place where the Shroud of Eden was said to be kept. The air in the archives was cool and carried the scent of history. She felt the weight of her father's expectations, the air of the room seeming to hum with the memory of his voice. She knew that while Jacob fought the war on the streets, she would have to fight the war in the shadows of the past. The air was full of the promise of a long, difficult struggle, and she was prepared to be the steady hand that guided them through the darkness. The twins stood together on the balcony of their new hideout, a converted train carriage that sat in a hidden siding. The air was cold and the fog was thick, but they could see the lights of the city stretching out before them. They were the Frye twins, and they had come to reclaim London. The air was filled with the sound of the city's industry, a heartbeat that they were determined to master. As the first light of dawn began to break through the soot, the air felt fresh and full of possibility. The battle for the soul of the British Empire had begun, and the twins were ready to breathe it in, one burrow at a time. The air in Whitechapel was a suffocating fog of misery, smelling of open drains, boiled cabbage, and the bitter soot of 1,000 coal fires. Jacob and Evie Frye moved through the narrow alleys, their boots splashing in the cold mud that coated the cobblestones. Whitechapel was the territory of Rixford Kaylock, a Templar lieutenant who ruled through fear and the muscle of his gang, the Blighters. The air here felt heavy, as if the very buildings were leaning in to listen to the desperate whispers of the poor. Jacob walked with a swagger, his knuckles itching for a fight, while Evie kept to the shadows of the overhanging timber frames, her eyes scanning the rooftops for snipers. The air was filled with the distant, mournful cries of street vendors and the low growl of a neighborhood on the edge of collapse. To break Kaylock's grip, Jacob knew he had to win over the local inhabitants. He sought out the leaders of the small, unorganized groups that were tired of paying the Blighters for protection. The air in the back rooms of the local pubs was thick with the smell of stale beer and the nervous sweat of men who were afraid to hope. Jacob spoke to them not of codes or creeds, but of strength and the pride of belonging to something bigger. He called his new organization the Rooks. The air in the room began to change, the fear being replaced by a sharp, electric sense of rebellion. Jacob felt the weight of leadership settling on his shoulders, and the air seemed to clear as he looked at the faces of his new brothers and sisters. While Jacob built his army, Evie focused on the logistical heart of the Templar operation. She tracked a series of stolen medical supplies that were being hoarded in a nearby warehouse. The air inside the warehouse was cold and smelled of iodine, old wood, and the chemical tang of cheap spirits used to preserve anatomical specimens. She moved through the high crates with the silence of a ghost, her breath steady in the chill air. She discovered that the supplies were being sold at inflated prices to the very people who had made them. A cruel cycle of greed orchestrated by Kaylock. The air was filled with with the scratching of rats in the walls and the heavy, rhythmic snoring of the guards. Evie didn't just reclaim the supplies. She ensured they were distributed back to the clinics. The air of the streets momentarily sweetened by a rare act of justice. The twins eventually cornered Rixford Kaylock at the local train station, where the air was a chaotic swirl of steam, coal dust, and the screeching of iron wheels. Kaylock was a man of brute force, and the air around him was thick with the smell of expensive cigars and the iron scent of the revolvers his men carried. A massive brawl broke out on the platforms, the air ringing with the sound of breaking glass and the heavy thud of fists against skin. Jacob led the rooks in a charge, their green scarves a flash of color in the gray smog. The air was hot from the idling engines, making every breath feel like a struggle. Jacob finally faced Kaylock atop a moving train car, the wind whipping his coat as the iron beast roared out of the station. The fight on the roof of the train was a desperate dance of balance and steel. The air rushed past them, carrying the scent of burning wood and the cold mist of the morning. Kaylock fought with the ferocity of a trapped animal, but Jacob's training under his father had made him a master of the close-quarter strike. The air was filled with the rhythmic clatter of the tracks as Jacob delivered a final, crushing blow. As Kaylock lay defeated, he surrendered his personal train to the twins, a massive locomotive that became their mobile headquarters. The air in the command car was quiet and smelled of leather, oil, and the dry scent of old maps. For the first time, the Frye twins had a home in the city, and the heir of Whitekapelle was finally free of the Blighter's shadow. With Whitekapelle secured, the twins met with Henry Green to plan their next move. The air in the train car was warm, heated by a small coal stove that filled the space with a comforting glow. They were joined by a young woman named Clara O'D, the leader of the city's many street urchins. The air in the carriage was filled with her sharp, precocious voice as she described the network of children who saw everything that happened in the shadows. She agreed to help the rooks in exchange for their protection. The air felt charged with a new kind of power. They were no longer just two assassins, but the architects of a growing revolution. Jacob looked out at the sprawling city, the heir of the next borough, Southwark, waiting to be taken. Evie spent her nights in the train's small library, the air smelling of the ink she used to translate the precursor documents she had recovered from Kaylock's desk. She found a reference to a man named David Brewster, a scientist working for the Templars on a secret project involving electricity and ancient artifacts. The air in the laboratory, reports she read, was full of technical jargon and the underlying dread of a man who didn't understand the power he was tampering with. Evie knew that while Jacob was busy with the gangs, she had to stop Brewster before his experiments tore the air of London apart. She felt the pressure of time, the air in the carriage seeming to tick like the many clocks that lined the walls. Jacob, meanwhile, began to expand the Rook's influence into the industrial district of Southwark. The air there was even thicker with pollution, smelling of the chemical runoff from the tanneries and the metallic tang of the iron foundries. He targeted the local factory foremen who were loyal to Starrick. The air of the factory floors filled with the sound of his brass knuckles meeting their mark. He was becoming a legend in the slums, a man who brought the light of the green flag to the darkest corners of the city. The air in the pubs was full of stories of his exploits, and every day more people joined the Rooks, their presence a growing weight against the Templars' control. As the sun set over the Thames, the air turned a deep, bruised purple, the smog reflecting the orange glow of the city's many fires. Jacob and Evie stood together on the rear platform of their train, watching the tracks stretch out behind them. The air was cold and fresh as the train picked up speed, the sound of the engine a steady, powerful heartbeat. They had taken their first borough, but they knew that Crawford Starrick would not remain silent for long. The air of London was a battlefield, and the Frye twins were just getting started. They looked toward the towering silhouette of the Houses of Parliament, the air there heavy with the power they were destined to challenge. The night was quiet, save for the distant rumble of the city and the soft hiss of the steam from the locomotive. The air in the train was filled with the scent of a shared victory, but also the sharp, metallic scent of the blades they would need for the coming days. They were a team, a perfect balance of action and thought, and the air of London felt like it was finally beginning to belong to them. Jacob checked his gear, the metal clicking in the silence, while Evie closed her book, the air of the room still and expectant. They were ready for whatever the morning would bring. The spirit of the Brotherhood guiding them through the fog of the industrial age. The air in Southwark was a thick, choking veil of yellow sulfur, and the metallic tang of the great iron foundries that lined the banks of the Thames. Jacob and Evie Frye sat in the plush leather seats of their moving headquarters, the air inside the train car smelling of cedar, and the faint, sweet scent of the tea Henry Green had prepared. While the train rattled over the iron bridges, the twins prepared for their separate paths. Evie was focused on the laboratory of David Brewster, a scientist whose work with precursor artifacts threatened to unleash a power the city was not prepared to handle. Jacob, however, was looking at the soot-stained streets of the district below, where the air was filled with the cries of the sick and the smell of the toxic, soothing syrups being sold to the poor by a Templar-backed doctor named John Elliotson. The air between the twins was tense, each believing their mission was the more vital to the survival of the city. Evie's path took her to the dark, high-vaulted chambers of a secret underground facility beneath a Southwark factory. The air in the tunnels was cold and damp, smelling of limestone and the sharp, ozone scent of primitive electrical batteries. She moved with the grace of a shadow, her boots making no sound on the wet stone. As she neared Brewster's private workshop, the air began to hum with a strange, high-pitched vibration that made her skin tingle. She watched from a high ventilation grate as Brewster, A man with frantic eyes and trembling hands attempted to force power into a glowing shard of Eden. The air in the room was shimmering with heat and a green, sickly light. Evie knew she had to act quickly. The air felt like it was on the verge of exploding. She dropped from the ceiling, her hidden blade extended, but the air was suddenly ripped apart by a massive discharge of energy. The shard shattered, and the shockwave threw her back against the cold stone wall. The air was filled with the smell of scorched metal and the blinding white light of a dying artifact. Brewster lay among the ruins of his machinery, the life leaving his eyes as he whispered of a grand design that went far beyond London. Evie felt the vibration in the air fade into a heavy, mournful silence. She recovered what remained of the data. The air in the room, now smelling of nothing but dust and failure. She realized the Templars were not just looking for weapons. They were trying to rewrite the laws of the physical world. While Evie dealt with the laboratory, Jacob was navigating the crowded, desperate wards of the Lambeth Asylum. The air inside the stone building was stagnant and heavy, smelling of carbolic acid, unwashed bedding, and the underlying scent of fear. He moved through the halls disguised as a common laborer, the air filled with the low moans of the patients and the sharp, authoritative footsteps of the guards. Dr. Elliotson was performing public demonstrations of medical progress that were little more than torture. The air in the operating theater was hot and smelled of blood, and the copper scent of the surgical tools. Jacob watched from the shadows of the upper gallery, his knuckles white as he gripped the railing. He waited for the moment when the doctor was most vulnerable. The air in the theater held in a collective, terrified breath. Jacob struck during the height of the demonstration. He swung from the gallery on a rope, the air rushing past his face as he landed on the center stage. The air was suddenly filled with the screams of the observers and the frantic shouting of the orderlies. He moved with a brutal, street-taught efficiency, his brass knuckles making a dull thud against the doctor's jaw. The air was thick with the scent of the ether that had been spilled in the struggle. Jacob delivered a final, silent strike with his hidden blade, ending the doctor's career and his cruelty in one motion. As he escaped through a window into the cool night air, he felt the weight of the district begin to lift. The air in Southwark was still dirty, but the poison in its medicine had been purged. The twins met back at the train as it passed through the outskirts of the district. The air in the carriage was filled with the smell of the night rain and the soot of the engine. Evie told Jacob of the shard's destruction and the warnings Brewster had given, her voice quiet in the rhythmic clatter of the tracks. Jacob spoke of the asylum and the rooks who were now securing the streets of Southwark. The air between them was less tense now, a shared understanding of the different ways a city can be broken and mended. They were a team of two different spirits, one seeking the light of knowledge, and the other the strength of the people. The air of London felt vast and challenging, but they were no longer strangers to its darkness. The next morning, the air was crisp, and carried the smell of the Thames, which was always a mixture of salt and rot. They were visited by a man named Charles Dickens, a writer who walked the streets with a keen eye for the stories hidden in the fog. The air in the carriage was filled with his quick, energetic speech as he told them of the Ghost Club and the strange, inexplicable events occurring in the slums. He saw the twins not as killers, but as characters in the grand, unfolding drama of the city. The air felt lighter in his presence, a reminder that London was not just a battlefield, but a place of imagination and life. Jacob enjoyed the man's wit, while Evie appreciated his deep understanding of the city's social fabric. As they looked toward the next borough, the city of London, the air turned a cold, steely gray. This was the financial heart of the empire, where the air smelled of gold, ink, and the high-priced tobacco of the merchant princes. It was the stronghold of the Templar bankers who funded Starrick's ambitions. Jacob planned to disrupt the flow of money, while Evie intended to search the ancient vaults for more clues about the shroud. The air was full of the sound of the city's bells, a constant reminder of the time they had left. They checked their equipment, the air in the train car still and focused. They were the masters of Southwark and Whitechapel, and the city was their next target. The night ended with the train pulling into a secret siding near the docks. The air was thick with the smell of tar and hemp, and the distant sound of a foghorn echoed across the water. Jacob stood on the platform, his eyes fixed on the lights of the Tower of London in the distance. The air was cold and fresh, carrying the promise of new challenges. Evie sat by the small lamp in the carriage, her eyes tired, but her resolve unshaken. They had survived the laboratories and the asylums, and they were ready for the boardrooms and the vaults. The air of London was a living thing, and they were learning how to breathe with it. The twins closed their eyes for a few hours of rest, the air in the train car becoming quiet and rhythmic. The sound of the city was a low hum in the distance, a reminder of the millions of lives that depended on their success. They were the Frye twins, the catalysts of change in a world of iron and steam. As the first light of dawn touched the soot on the windows, the air felt full of hope. The struggle for London was moving into its most dangerous phase, and they were prepared to face it together. The green flag of the Rooks flying high in their hearts. The air in the city of London was different from the soot-stained slums of the south. It was a cold, sharp atmosphere that smelled of expensive parchment, wet ink, and the high-grade tobacco of men who traded in nations. Here, the great stone banks and trading houses stood like fortresses, their shadows long and imposing over the narrow, busy streets. Jacob and Evie Frye moved through the crowds of men in top hats, their own fine coats allowing them to blend into the upper-class rush. The city was the financial heart of Crawford Starrick's empire, governed by the ruthless financier Philip Tuppenny. The air felt heavy with the invisible weight of gold, a pressure that dictated the lives of everyone from the beggars in the alleys to the queen in her palace. Jacob's goal was to cut off the flow of Templar money. He had learned that Tuppenny was using the Bank of England as his personal vault, orchestrating a scheme to destabilize the currency for his own profit. The air around the bank was thick with the presence of armed guards and the constant, frantic energy of the messengers. Jacob did not plan a subtle entry. He wanted to strike at the vault itself. He spent his afternoon in the nearby taverns, the air smelling of roasted meats and fine ale, recruiting a group of disgruntled bank clerks and security men to the rooks. The air was full of the quiet, conspiratorial murmurs of men who were tired of being cogs in Tuppenny's machine. While Jacob prepared his heist, Evie sought out a different kind of treasure. Her research into the Shroud of Eden had led her to the ancient archives hidden beneath the city. The air in the lower vaults was stagnant and smelled of the dry dust of centuries and the faint, sweet scent of old beeswax. She moved through the underground passages with a lantern, the light flickering against the damp stone walls. She discovered a hidden map that pointed toward the Tower of London, suggesting the shroud had been moved there during the Great Fire. The air in the vault felt charged with a sudden, cold clarity. She realized that while Jacob was fighting for the economy of the present, the Templars were preparing to use the relics of the past to control the future. The day of the bank heist arrived with a heavy, gray rain that turned the city streets into a mirror of the leaden sky. The air was cold and carried the scent of wet wool and the metallic tang of the street-level ironwork. Jacob infiltrated the Bank of England disguised as a high-stakes investor, the air inside the grand hall smelling of floor wax and the hushed, reverent silence of wealth. He moved through the private corridors, his heart beating a steady rhythm against the silence. When he reached the main vault, he found Tuppenny himself inside, checking the ledgers by the light of a single, flickering lamp. The air in the small, iron-bound room was thick with the smell of old copper and the dry breath of the ventilation shafts. Jacob struck as Tuppenny turned his back. The air was suddenly filled with the sound of a brief, frantic struggle. Jacob's hidden blade was silent, ending the financier's life before he could cry out. As Tuppenny died, he spoke of the necessity of greed to drive the wheels of progress, his voice a cold whisper in the dark of the vault. Jacob felt a flash of the man's memories, seeing the connections between the bank and the government. The air in the vault felt lighter as Jacob secured the ledgers that proved the Templar corruption. He escaped through the rooftop, the air of the rainy night feeling fresh and clean after the suffocating atmosphere of the bank. Evie, meanwhile, was navigating the high battlements of the Tower of London. The air there was wild with the wind from the Thames, smelling of salt and the old, cold iron of the cannons. She was looking for a secret chamber mentioned in the vault map. She encountered a group of Templar guards who were searching for the same relic. The air was filled with the sound of their heavy boots and the sharp, metallic clatter of their bayonets. Evie moved through the shadows with the precision of a hawk, her hidden blade finding its mark in the silence. She reached the chamber, but it was empty, the air inside smelling of nothing but damp stone and the absence of a long-gone treasure. She realized she was one step behind Lucy Thorne, Starrick's most dangerous lieutenant. The twins met that evening at their train headquarters as it steamed through the city. The air in the carriage was warm and smelled of the wood fire in the stove. Jacob showed Evie the bank ledgers, his face flushed with the adrenaline of the heist. Evie told him of the empty chamber and the growing threat of Lucy Thorne. The air between them was a mix of triumph and growing concern. They were winning the war for the streets, but the search for the piece of Eden was becoming a race they could not afford to lose. The air of London was full of the sound of the city's many clocks, a reminder that Starrick's influence was still vast and deep. They were visited by a young man named Alexander Graham Bell, an inventor whose mind was as fast as the electrical pulses he studied. The air in the carriage was filled with the ozone scent of his experiments as he showed them a new tool, the rope launcher. It was a device that used compressed air to fire a grappling hook and a high-strength wire. The air in the carriage was suddenly filled with the sharp hiss of the mechanism. Jacob and Evie took to the tool immediately, realizing it would allow them to navigate the wide streets of the city and Westminster with ease. The air of London was no longer a barrier. It was a highway. As the sun set, the city was illuminated by the golden glow of the gaslights, the air reflecting the warmth of the fires. Jacob and Evie stood on the roof of their train, testing their new rope launchers against the towering skyline. The air rushed past them as they zipped between the buildings, the sound of the wire a high, singing note in the night. They felt a sense of freedom they had never known in the narrow alleys of Whitechapel. The city was beneath them, and for the first time, they felt like they truly commanded the air of the capital. The night ended with the twins planning their move into Westminster, the political heart of the empire. The air there would be different again, smelling of the Thames, the stone of the Parliament, and the ancient power of the monarchy. They knew that Starrick would be waiting for them there, his shadow long and dark. Jacob sharpened his blade, the metal making a soft, rhythmic sound in the quiet of the train car. Evie studied the maps, the air in the room still and focused. They were the Frye twins, and they were ready to take the fight to the very steps of the throne. The air in Lambeth was a damp, clinging mist that smelled of river mud, sulfur, and the sharp, medicinal tang of lye. This borough was a place of extremes, where the grand stone walls of the Lambeth Palace stood in stark contrast to the sprawling, soot-stained tenements and the overcrowded wards of the local hospitals. Jacob and Evie Frye moved through the district, their coats damp from the constant drizzle. The air here was heavy with the sounds of coughing and the rattling wheels of the carts carrying away the dead. Crawford Starrick's influence in Lambeth was felt through the control of the medical supply chains and the corrupt administration of the local infirmaries. which were more interested in profit than healing. Jacob's attention was drawn to the rumors of a black market for medicine that was leaving the poor with nothing but colored water and sugar pills. The air in the back alley apothecaries was thick with the smell of cheap alcohol and the dusty scent of dried herbs that had long since lost their potency. He discovered that the distribution was being handled by a man named John Elliotson's former associates, who were still loyal to the Templar cause. Jacob moved through the slums with the rooks, the air filled with the quiet, rhythmic thud of their boots on the wet cobblestones. He spent his days dismantling the supply lines, his brass knuckles making short work of the thugs who guarded the crates of stolen tonics. The air in the warehouses was cold and smelled of damp cardboard, and the iron scent of the revolvers the guards drew in vain. While Jacob cleared the streets, Evie sought out a different kind of ally. She had heard of a nurse named Florence Nightingale, who was fighting a losing battle against the lack of supplies and the filth of the wards. The air in the makeshift clinic where they met was stagnant and smelled of carbolic acid and the metallic scent of blood. Nightingale was a woman of fierce resolve, her eyes tired but bright with a stubborn light. The air in the clinic was filled with the low moans of the suffering, a sound that made Evie's grip on her cane tighten. Nightingale told her that a Templar operative was intentionally diverting the hospital's funds to build a private laboratory for Starrick. The air between them was a shared understanding of the cost of the Templars' greed. Evie's investigation led her to a grand mansion on the edge of the district, where the air was a sharp contrast to the clinics, smelling of roasting meat and fine cherry wood. This was the home of a corrupt official who was skimming the hospital's budget. Evie infiltrated the house during a lavish dinner party, the air inside light with the sound of laughter and the scent of expensive perfume. She moved through the service corridors, the air smelling of the coal dust from the kitchens. She found the ledger proving the embezzlement in a private study that smelled of old tobacco and leather. As she secured the documents, she was nearly discovered by a guard, the air suddenly thick with the sound of his heavy, rhythmic breathing as he searched the dark room. Jacob, meanwhile, was preparing to confront the man responsible for the soothing syrup scam. The air in the district's main distribution hub was hot and smelled of the boiling sugar and chemicals used to create the fake medicine. Jacob led the rooks in a direct assault, the air ringing with the sound of breaking glass and the shouts of the combatants. He found the lead chemist in a small office at the back, the air there thick with the scent of the ether used in the concoctions. Jacob didn't hesitate. His hidden blade was a silent end to the man's career. As he walked out into the cool night air, he felt the oppressive weight of the district's sickness begin to lift. The air was still gray with smog, but the people of Lambeth would no longer be poisoned by their own hope. The twins met that evening on a rooftop overlooking the Thames, the air cold and carrying the salt of the sea. Evie showed Jacob the recovered funds and the ledger, her face pale in the moonlight. Jacob told her of the destruction of the syrup factory, the air around him still smelling faintly of the chemicals. They realized that their work in Lambeth had saved thousands of lives, but the core of Starrick's power remained untouched in the heart of Westminster. The air of London was a vast, interconnected web, and every victory they won seemed to reveal a new layer of the Templars' control. They watched the lights of the city flicker in the fog, the air between them silent and focused. They were visited once more by Henry Green, the air in their meeting place, a quiet churchyard smelling of damp grass, and the old stone of the monuments. Henry told them that Lucy Thorne was intensifying her search for the Shroud of Eden, and that the air in the Tower of London was now thick with her agents. Evie felt the pressure of the race once again, the air in the churchyard seeming to grow colder at the mention of the artifact. She knew that the shroud was not just a myth, but a weapon that could make Starrick immortal. Jacob, however, was focused on the next gang war, the air of the city already vibrating with the news of the Rook's expansion. As the night ended, the twins boarded their train headquarters, the air inside warm and smelling of the wood fire in the stove. Jacob cleaned his equipment, the metal clicking in the silence, while Evie studied the maps of Westminster. The air in the carriage was filled with the scent of a shared purpose, a bond that was their greatest strength. They were the Frye twins, the protectors of the poor and the hunters of the shadows. The air of London was changing, the heavy weight of the Templars' grip beginning to fray under their persistent strikes. They looked toward the towering silhouette of the Palace of Westminster, the air there waiting for the storm they were bringing. The morning brought a pale, watery sun that struggled to break through the soot of the horizon. The air was crisp and smelled of the river's mist. Jacob and Evie stood on the platform of their train, watching the city wake up. They knew that the fight for Lambeth was just a prelude to the battle for the seat of power. The air was full of the sound of the city's bells, a constant, rhythmic reminder of their mission. They checked their hidden blades, the air in the train car still and expectant. They were ready for whatever the heart of the Empire would throw at them. The journey toward Westminster was a slow climb through the gears of the city's power. The air became cleaner as they moved toward the royal parks, smelling of mown grass and the ancient trees of the nobility. But beneath the surface, the air was still thick with the same greed and control they had fought in the slums. Jacob and Evie were the catalysts of change, the two spirits that would breathe a new life into the old stone of the capital. They were ready to take the fight to the halls of government. The green flag of the Rooks fluttering in the wind as the train roared into the heart of the darkness. The air in Southwark had become a stagnant sea of iron-scented mist, and the sulphurous breath of the great transit hubs. Jacob and Evie Frye returned to this district to find it gripped by a new kind of Templar control. Crawford Starrick had consolidated the city's transport through his cousin, Pearl Attaway, a woman whose charm was as sharp and cold as a razor. The air in the streets was filled with the rhythmic clatter of the new omnibus lines. But beneath the surface, the air smelled of a monopoly that was strangling the independent coachman. Jacob was drawn to the competitive energy of the bus companies, while Evie remained focused on the precursor secrets. She believed Pearl was hiding behind her industrial facade. Jacob's first move was to meet with Pearl at away herself, hoping to find a crack in her business empire. The air in her opulent office was a sharp contrast to the grime of the streets, smelling of expensive lilies, polished mahogany, and the dry scent of the many ledgers on her desk. Pearl was a woman who understood power, and the air around her felt heavy with the confidence of a Templar master. She manipulated Jacob into helping her take down a rival company, the air in the room thick with her sweet, deceptive promises. Jacob, ever the man of action, didn't see the trap. He spent his days sabotaging the rival carriages, the air in the stables smelling of wet hay, and the metallic tang of the tools he used to weaken the wheels. While Jacob played Pearl's game, Evie followed a trail of rumors about a secret shipment of precursor artifacts destined for the Etouet transport depots. The air in the docks was cold and carried the scent of tar and the salty rot of the low tide. She infiltrated a warehouse where the air was still and smelled of the cedarwood crates used to transport the artifacts. She found a series of letters between Pearl and Starrick that revealed a plan to use the transport network to distribute Templar propaganda across the empire. The air in the office was thick with the smell of the ink and the tallow candles used to seal the letters. Evie realized that Pearl was not just a businesswoman. She was the architect of a psychological war. Jacob's cooperation with Pearl came to a sudden, violent end when he discovered she was responsible for the disappearance of several rooks who had tried to organize the coachmen. The air in the back alley meeting place was cold and smelled of damp stone and the iron scent of the blood that had been spilled. Jacob's face was a mask of cold fury, the air around him vibrating with his need for justice. He decided to end the Etouet monopoly once and for all. He led the rooks in a direct assault on the main transport depot, the air ringing with the sound of breaking glass and the shouts of the combatants. He found Pearl in the center of the yard, the air there thick with the smoke of a burning carriage. The confrontation was swift and brutal. Pearl fought with a hidden blade of her own, the air whistling as she struck at Jacob with a desperate, practiced speed. But Jacob was a man born of the streets, and his movements were a fluid response to her attacks. The air was hot from the fires, making every breath feel like a struggle. Jacob delivered a final strike, the air suddenly quiet as Pearl fell. As she died, she spoke of the order that Starrick would bring to the chaos of the world, her voice a fatting whisper in the heavy air of the depot. Jacob stood over her, the air around him still smelling of the smoke and the sulfur. He had broken the monopoly, but he felt a sense of hollow victory, knowing he had been used by the very woman he had just killed. Evie, meanwhile, was intercepting the final shipment of artifacts. The air on the moving train was wild with the wind, smelling of the coal smoke from the engine. She fought her way through the guards, her hidden blade a silent end to their interference. She reached the main crate, but inside she found not a piece of Eden, but a collection of maps showing the ley lines beneath the city of London. The air in the carriage felt pressurized, the maps glowing with a faint, amber light. She realized that the Templars were mapping the ancient tunnels to find the shroud. She secured the maps, the air of the night feeling cold and fresh as she leaped from the train into the dark. The twins met that evening at their train headquarters, the air inside warm and smelling of the wood fire. Jacob was quiet, his mind occupied by the manipulation of Pearl Attaway. Evie showed him the maps, her face pale in the light of the lamp. The air between them was a mix of frustration and a renewed sense of purpose. They realized that Starrick's reach was even deeper than they had imagined. The air of London was a web of secrets, and every time they pulled a thread, the whole structure seemed to shift. They watched the city lights flicker in the fog, the air full of the sound of the many clocks, a constant reminder of the time they were losing. They were visited by Charles Darwin, a man whose mind was focused on the evolution of life rather than the politics of the city. The air in the carriage was filled with his calm, measured speech as he told them of the dangerous experiments being conducted in the local parks. He saw the twins as a necessary force of nature, a check on the excesses of the industrial age. The air felt lighter in his presence, a reminder of the natural world that existed beneath the soot and the iron. Jacob and Evie appreciated his perspective, the air of the room still and respectful, as they listened to his warnings about the Templars' misuse of science. As the night ended, the twins looked toward the next borough, the industrial heart of the East End. The air there would be the thickest of all, smelling of the chemical plants and the sweat of the thousands who worked the looms. They knew that Starrick would be waiting for them there, his shadow long and dark over the factories. Jacob checked his gear, the metal clicking in the silence, while Evie studied the maps, the air in the room still and expectant. They were the Frye twins, and they were ready to take the fight to the very heart of the machine. The morning brought a heavy rain that washed the soot from the windows of the train. The air was crisp and smelled of the wet earth. Jacob and Evie stood on the platform, watching the city wake up once more. They knew that the fight for Southwark was just a chapter in a much larger story. The air was full of the sound of the city's bells, a constant, rhythmic reminder of their mission. They checked their hidden blades, the air in the train car still and focused. They were ready for whatever the East End would throw at them. The air in the East End was a thick, stagnant fog that smelled of boiled fat, chemical lye, and the heavy, metallic dust of the textile mills. This was the raw, unpolished engine of London, where the sun was often a mere pale disk behind a curtain of industrial smoke. Jacob and Evie Frye moved through the maze of narrow streets, the air around them vibrating with the deafening clatter of the looms and the deep, rhythmic thud of the steam hammers. The district was under the thumb of Malcolm Milner, a factory owner who produced the majority of the city's uniforms and textiles. The air in Milner's territory was one of exhaustion. The workers moved like ghosts through the smog, their lungs filled with the same soot that coated the brick walls of their tenements. Jacob's focus was on the human cost of the East End's industry. He had heard stories of Milner's factories where the doors were locked from the outside to prevent breaks, the air inside becoming a hot, breathless soup of sweat and lint. Jacob infiltrated one of these mills, the air hitting him like a physical blow as he stepped onto the floor. It was filled with the deafening roar of 100 machines, a sound that drowned out even the loudest shout. He saw children as young as 6 crawling under moving gears to clear snags, the air around them charged with the static of the spinning wool. Jacob felt a cold, sharp anger. He didn't just want to kill Milner, he wanted to dismantle the system that allowed such misery to breathe. While Jacob navigated the factories, Evie was following a lead that connected Milner to a secret warehouse used by Crawford Starrick to store precursor materials stolen from the British Museum. The air in the warehouse district near the docks was salty and cold, smelling of rotting fish and the damp timber of the wharves. She moved along the rooftops, the air whistling through the rigging of the nearby ships. She discovered that Milner was using his shipping contracts to smuggle artifacts out of the city and into the hands of Templar agents across Europe. The air in the foreman's office was thick with the scent of the coal stove and the dry, papery smell of the shipping manifests. Evie realized that Milner was the logistics expert for the entire Templar operation in London. Jacob's campaign against Milner began with a series of targeted strikes on the factory's supply lines. The air in the streets was filled with the shouts of the rooks as they intercepted the wagons carrying raw cotton. Jacob used the chaos to slip into Milner's private estate, a grand house that sat on a hill overlooking the smog of the factories. The air in the estate was a sharp contrast to the mills, smelling of lavender and fresh-cut grass. He found Milner in a sunroom that smelled of lemon polish and expensive tea. The confrontation was brief. Milner was not a fighter, but a man of ledgers and profit. The air was silent as Jacob's hidden blade found its mark. As he died, Milner laughed, a dry and rasping sound, telling Jacob that his death would only make room for someone more ruthless. Evie, meanwhile, was intercepting a final shipment of artifacts at the East End docks. The air was a blur of gray mist and the orange glow of the dockside lanterns. She fought her way through a line of Templar guards, the air ringing with the sound of their heavy boots and the sharp, metallic clack of their bayonets. She reached the main crate just as it was being hoisted onto a ship. Inside, she found a series of ancient stone tablets that detailed the location of a vault beneath Buckingham Palace. The air around the tablets felt cold, carried a faint hum that made her teeth ache. She secured the tablets, the air of the night feeling heavy with the weight of the secret she now held. She knew the race for the shroud was entering its final, most dangerous stage. The twins met that evening on the roof of a brewery, the air smelling of fermented grain and wood smoke. Jacob was troubled by Milner's final words, the air around him still smelling of the estate's lavender. Evie showed him the tablets, her face pale in the moonlight. They realized that their victories were taking a toll on the city's stability. The air of London was becoming more volatile as the power vacuum left by the dead Templars was filled by Starrick's direct intervention. The air was full of the sound of the city's bells, a constant, rhythmic reminder that the final confrontation was drawing near. They watched the smoke rise from the East End, the air between them silent and full of a growing tension. They were visited by a young man named Frederick Aberline, a police inspector who worked the Whitechapel beat. The air in their meeting place, a quiet alley, was cold and smelled of damp brick. Aberline was a man of the law, but he saw the necessity of the rooks in a city where the police were often in the pockets of the Templars. He told them of a new threat, a group of radicals within the Templar Order who were planning to use the chaos of the factory strikes to trigger a citywide riot. The air felt charged with a new sense of urgency. Jacob and Evie realized they had to manage the very rebellion they had started, ensuring it didn't burn the city to the ground. As the night ended, the twins returned to their train, the air inside warm and smelling of the wood fire. Jacob sharpened his kukri, the metal making a soft, rhythmic sound in the quiet of the carriage. Evie studied the tablets, the air in the room still and expectant. They were the Frye twins, and they had conquered the East End, but the cost was becoming clear. The air of London was a heavy, complicated thing, and they were the only ones who could keep it from suffocating. They looked toward the West End, where the lights of the theaters and the mansions sparkled in the distance. The air there would be the most refined of all, but they knew the darkness would be just as deep. The morning brought a sharp, cold wind that cleared the smog for a few brief hours. The air was fresh and smelled of the sea. Jacob and Evie stood on the platform of their train, watching the sun rise over the river. They knew that the fight for the East End was a turning point. The air was full of the sound of the city's industry, a heartbeat that they were slowly learning to control. They checked their hidden blades, the air in the train car still and focused. They were ready for whatever the West End and Crawford Starrick had waiting for them. The journey toward the West End was a move into the heart of the Empire's culture and leisure. The air would soon smell of perfume, fine wine, and the ancient stone of the museums. But beneath the elegance, the air was still thick with the same greed and control they had fought in the factories. Jacob and Evie were the catalysts of change, the two spirits that would breathe a new life into the old stone of the capital. They were ready to take the fight to the halls of the elite. The green flag of the rooks fluttering in the wind as the train roared into the final stretch of the journey. The air in the West End was a refined, deceptive mist that smelled of expensive perfumes, imported brandy, and the sweet, waxy scent of the thousands of candles that lit the grand theaters. This was the borough of leisure and high culture, where the streets were wide and the gas lamps glowed with a steady, golden light. Jacob and Evie Frye moved through the crowds of theater-goers, their own attire reflecting the elegance of the district. Beneath the surface of the music and the laughter, the air was heavy with the influence of David Brewster's replacement, a man named Maxwell Roth. Roth was a master of the stage and a radical Templar who viewed the world as a grand, violent play. The air in his presence was always unpredictable, carrying a sharp scent of theatrical makeup and the cold, metallic smell of the stage waits. Jacob was drawn to Roth's charisma and his apparent disregard for Crawford Starrick's rigid order. The air in Roth's private theater box was thick with the smoke of fine cigars and the intoxicating scent of heavy velvet curtains. Roth proposed a partnership to dismantle Starrick's remaining infrastructure in the West End, his voice a smooth, dramatic baritone that filled the small space. Jacob, feeling the strain of his sister's constant caution, agreed to help. They spent several nights sabotaging Templar-owned warehouses, the air in the streets filled with the sound of explosions that Roth treated as a grand finale. Jacob felt a strange, wild energy in these missions, but the air around Roth began to feel increasingly dangerous, smelling of a madness that didn't care who got caught in the crossfire. While Jacob was lost in the drama of the West End, Evie was following a lead that led her to the British Museum. The air inside the great stone halls was cold and stagnant, smelling of dry paper, ancient dust, and the faint, sweet scent of the chemicals used to preserve the exhibits. She was searching for a hidden entrance to the precursor vaults mentioned in the East End tablets. She discovered that Lucy Thorne had already established a research base within the museum, the air in the Egyptian gallery vibrating with the hum of the Templar equipment. Evie moved through the shadows of the sarcophagi, her breath silent. She realized that the Templars were using the museum's vast collection to cross-reference the locations of the Peace of Eden. The air in the gallery felt charged with the weight of the thousands of years of history watching her. Jacob's partnership with Maxwell Roth reached a horrific conclusion during a mission to destroy a Templar-run printing press. Roth had filled the building with explosives, but he had also locked the workers inside to ensure the drama of the event was high enough. The air in the printing house was hot and smelled of ink, paper, and the sudden, terrifying scent of burning oil. Jacob arrived just as the first charges went off, the air ringing with the screams of the trapped men and women. He realized that Roth was not a rebel against order, but a monster who fed on chaos. Jacob fought his way through the flames to open the doors, the air in his lungs burning with every breath. He saved the workers, but the air of the West End was now stained with the soot of Roth's betrayal. The final confrontation between Jacob and Maxwell, Roth, took place during a crowded performance at the Alhambra Music Hall. The air in the hall was a suffocating mix of heat, perfume, and the excitement of the audience. Roth had rigged the stage with fire, creating a literal curtain of flame that separated him from the world. Jacob moved through the rafters, the air at the top of the hall thin and smelling of the scorched wood of the stage. He dropped into the center of the fire, the air whistling past his ears as he faced the madman. The fight was a blur of movement and light, the air filled with the sound of Roth's laughter and the clashing of their blades. Jacob delivered a final, somber strike, the air growing quiet as the fire began to consume the stage. As Roth died, he thanked Jacob for the perfect performance, his voice a rasping whisper in the heat. Evie, meanwhile, was engaged in a deadly game of cat and mouse with Lucy thorn atop the roofs of the British Museum. The air was cold and carrying the scent of the coming rain. Lucy was a woman of absolute conviction, and the air around her felt as rigid and cold as the stone statues below. They fought along the edge of the great dome, the air filled with the sound of their heavy breathing and the metallic clatter of their hidden blades. Lucy spoke of the necessity of the shroud to heal the world's chaos, but Evie knew that in Templar hands, it would only be used to enforce a static, lifeless order. Evie managed to secure a key fragment from Lucy, but the Templar escaped into the fog of the night, the air feeling heavy with the knowledge that their final meeting was still to come. The twins met that evening at their train headquarters, the air inside smelling of the damp wool of their coats and the wood smoke of the stove. Jacob was covered in soot, his eyes tired and haunted by the fires of the West End. Evie was pale, the cold of the museum still in her bones. The air between them was a thick, heavy silence. They realized that their individual paths were leading them toward a darkness that neither had fully anticipated. Jacob understood the danger of unchecked chaos, while Evie felt the crushing weight of the responsibility she carried. They sat in the quiet of the carriage, the only sound the rhythmic ticking of the clocks and the distant rumble of the city. They were visited by a young actress who had survived the fire at the music hall, the air in the carriage filled with her quiet, trembling thanks. She brought a message from the common people of the West End, who were beginning to see the Rooks as their true protectors. The air felt a little lighter in her presence, a reminder that their actions had real consequences for the lives of the people they sought to save. Jacob and Evie shared a look of mutual respect, the air of the room still and focused. They were the Frye twins, and they had survived the theaters and the museums. But the heart of the empire, Westminster, was still waiting for them. As the night ended, the twins looked toward the sprawling silhouette of the Palace of Westminster, the air there heavy with the power of the government and the monarchy. They knew that Crawford Starrick was preparing for his final move. The air of London was a vast, complicated machine, and they were the only ones who could stop it from crushing the people. Jacob cleaned his brass knuckles the metal clicking in the silence. While Evie studied the key fragment, the air in the room still and expectant. They were ready for the final act of their own drama. The morning brought a heavy, yellow fog that blanketed the city, the air smelling of the river and the soot. Jacob and Evie stood on the platform of their train, watching the city disappear into the mist. They knew that the fight for the West End was over, but the war for London was just beginning its final chapter. The air was full of the sound of the city's bells, a constant, rhythmic reminder of their mission. They checked their hidden blades, the air in the train car still and focused. They were ready for Crawford Starrick and the heart of the darkness. The year was 1815, and the air in Westminster was a heavy, cold mist that smelled of the dark water of the Thames, the sharp scent of wet stone, and the ancient wood of the halls of power. This was the heart of the British Empire, where the massive silhouette of the Houses of Parliament stood like a silent guardian over the river. Jacob and Evie Frye moved through the shadows of the Victoria Tower, their coats damp from the clinging fog. Crawford Starrick had turned his attention to the political machinery of the nation. Using a high-ranking Templar named James Brudenell, the Earl of Cardigan, to manipulate the government into passing a series of restrictive laws. The air in Westminster felt rigid and pressurized, as if the weight of the laws being debated inside were pressing down on the streets themselves. Jacob's mission was to infiltrate the Palace of Westminster and remove the Earl of Cardigan before he could finalize the political coup. The air inside the palace was a sharp contrast to the damp streets, smelling of expensive floor wax, old leather, and the dry, papery scent of 1,000 legal documents. Jacob moved through the ornate corridors, his boots silent on the thick carpets. He watched from behind a stone pillar as the Earl spoke to a group of nervous politicians, his voice a sharp, arrogant bark that echoed in the high-arched hallway. The air in the room was thick with the scent of the heavy tallow candles and the stagnant energy of men who traded in secrets. Jacob felt a cold, focused anger as he realized how easily these men could sign away the freedoms of the people he had spent months fighting to protect. While Jacob navigated the halls of Parliament, Evie was following a lead that took her beneath the foundations of the building. Her research had revealed that the Shroud of Eden was connected to the very stones of the city's history. The air in the sub-basements was cold and smelled of river mud, and the ancient, earthy scent of the London clay. She found a hidden door marked with the same precursor symbols she had seen in the British Museum. The air around the door vibrated with a low, rhythmic hum that made her pulse quicken. She used the key fragment she had taken from Lucy Thorne, the air clicking with a metallic sound as the mechanism turned. Inside, she found a chamber filled with glowing blue light that illuminated a series of projections showing the layout of a secret vault beneath Buckingham Palace. Jacob's confrontation with the Earl of Cardigan took place in the private chambers of the House of Lords. The air in the room was still and smelled of the burning peat in the fireplace. The Earl was a man of the old guard, and the air around him was thick with the pride of his station. He didn't see Jacob until it was too late. The struggle was brief and quiet, the air in the room barely stirred by the movement. As the Earl died, he spoke of the necessity of a strong hand to guide the rabble of London, his voice a fatting rasp in the warmth of the fire. Jacob stood over him, the air around him smelling of the peat smoke and the cold metallic scent of his hidden blade. He had stopped the coup, but he felt the crushing weight of the responsibility he now carried for the city's future. Evie, meanwhile, was mapping the projections in the underground chamber. The air was filled with a high-pitched hum that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. She realized that the shroud was not just a healing relic, but a power source that maintained the equilibrium of the city's ley lines. The air in the chamber felt thick and electric, making her hair stand on end. She recorded the coordinates for the vault, the air of the chamber growing dim as she removed the key. She knew that Lucy Thorne and Crawford Starrick would be heading for the palace soon. The air of Westminster was now a race against time, a scramble to reach the heart of the monarchy before the Templars could claim their prize. The twins met that evening on a bridge overlooking the Thames, the air cold and carrying the salt of the sea. Jacob told Evie of the Earl's death and the files he had recovered detailing the Templars' influence in the police force. Evie showed him the coordinates for the Buckingham Palace vault, her face pale in the moonlight. The air between them was a thick, heavy silence. They realized that their individual battles were finally merging into a single, final conflict. The air of London was full of the sound of the city's bells, a constant, rhythmic reminder that the end was near. They watched the lights of the Parliament reflect in the dark water, the air between them silent and full of a growing resolve. They were visited by Henry Green, the air in their meeting place, a quiet park near the river smelling of damp grass and the scent of the nearby gardens. Henry told them that Starrick had retreated to his private estate to prepare for the final move. The air in the park was still and expectant. Evie felt the pressure of the race once again, the air in the park seeming to grow colder at the thought of the shroud. She knew that the final confrontation would take place at the height of the social season, during a grand ball at Buckingham Palace. Jacob, however, was focused on the rooks, the air of the city already vibrating with the news of their victory in Westminster. As the night ended, the twins returned to their train headquarters, the air inside warm and smelling of the wood fire. Jacob sharpened his blade, the metal making a soft, rhythmic sound in the quiet of the carriage. Evie studied the coordinates, the air in the room still and focused. They were the Frye twins, and they had conquered the political heart of the empire, but the final prize was still out of reach. The air of London was a heavy, complicated thing, and they were the only ones who could keep it from falling into the hands of a madman. They looked toward the silhouette of Buckingham Palace, The air, they're waiting for the storm they were bringing. The morning brought a pale, watery sun that struggled to break through the soot of the horizon. The air was crisp and smelled of the river's mist. Jacob and Evie stood on the platform of their train, watching the city wake up. They knew that the fight for Westminster was just a prelude to the battle for the throne. The air was full of the sound of the city's bells, a constant, rhythmic reminder of their mission. They checked their hidden blades, the air in the train car still and expectant. They were ready for whatever Crawford Starrick had waiting for them in the halls of the Queen. The journey toward Buckingham Palace was a final climb through the gears of the city's power. The air became cleaner as they moved toward the royal parks, smelling of mown grass and the ancient trees of the nobility. But beneath the elegance, the air was still thick with the same greed and control they had fought in the slums. Jacob and Evie were the catalysts of change, the two spirits that would breathe a new life into the old stone of the capital. They were ready to take the fight to the very heart of the empire. The green flag of the rooks fluttering in the wind as the train roared into the final stretch. The air at Buckingham Palace was a thick, sweet perfume of blooming lilies, expensive beeswax candles, and the crisp, cold scent of a London night. It was the height of the social season, and the air hummed with the sound of string quartets and the rustle of silk gowns. Jacob and Evie Frye stood at the edge of the grand ballroom, their clothes a perfect disguise of high society elegance that smelled of lavender and fine tailoring. Beneath the velvet and lace, their hidden blades were a cold, heavy presence against their skin. Crawford Starrick was somewhere in the palace, and the air felt electric with the knowledge that the Shroud of Eden was within reach. Evie could feel the low vibration of the precursor vault deep beneath her feet, a pulse that seemed to sync with her own heartbeat. Jacob's task was to secure the perimeter and neutralize the Templar snipers positioned along the high balustrades. The air on the palace rooftops was sharp and carried the scent of coal smoke and the distant, damp breath of the Thames. He moved with the quiet grace of a predator, his movements muffled by the thick stone of the cornices. He found the first sniper in a shadow behind a marble statue, the air around the man smelling of gunpowder and the iron scent of his rifle. Jacob struck quickly, the air barely stirred by the fall of the body. He moved from tower to tower, the air whistling through the stone arches as he cleared the way for the rooks. He knew that the success of the night depended on keeping the chaos outside the ballroom until the very last moment. While Jacob worked the heights, Evie moved through the crowded halls toward the royal archives. The air inside the private corridors was stagnant and smelled of old leather and the dry, papery scent of the Queen's correspondence. She encountered Lucy Thorne near the entrance to the hidden service stairs. The air between them turned cold and sharp, the scent of Thorne's rigid discipline clashing with the floral perfume of the palace. There was no room for words. The fight was a fierce, contained struggle in the narrow hallway, the air ringing with the metallic clack of their blades. Evie moved with a fluid precision, her mind focused on the key she needed. She delivered a final, decisive strike, the air growing quiet as Lucy Thorne fell against the mahogany door. As she died, Thorne whispered that the shroud would only bring a different kind of darkness, her voice a fading rasp in the still air. Evie took the master key from Thorne's belt, the air in the corridor smelling of the copper scent of blood and the wax of the nearby candles. She descended the hidden staircase, the air turning cold and damp as she moved below the palace foundations. The smell of the river mud returned, mixed with the ancient, earthy scent of the hidden vault. She reached the precursor door, which was glowing with a pale, rhythmic blue light that illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air. As she inserted the key, the air began to vibrate with a high-pitched hum that made her skin tingle. The stones ground against each other with a heavy, ancient sound, revealing a chamber that felt as if it existed outside of time. Inside the vault, the air was remarkably crisp and smelled of ozone and dry stone. In the center, resting on a pedestal of dark, polished metal, was the Shroud of Eden. It was a shimmering, translucent fabric that seemed to hold the light of 1,000 stars. The air around it was warm and felt thick, like moving through water. As Evie approached, the air was suddenly split by the sound of heavy footsteps. Crawford Starrick stepped from the shadows, his presence a dark weight in the glowing room. He was dressed in his full grand master regalia, and the air around him smelled of cold ambition and the metallic scent of the heavy revolvers he carried. He didn't want the shroud to heal. He wanted it to make him a god among the smoke and iron of his empire. The confrontation in the vault was interrupted by Jacob, who dropped from a ventilation shaft, the air rushing past him as he landed between his sister and the Grand Master. The air in the chamber was now a chaotic swirl of energy and tension. Starrick grabbed the shroud, wrapping it around his shoulders, and the air instantly surged with a golden light. His wounds began to close as quickly as they were made, the air filling with the scent of burning energy. The twins realized they had to work in perfect synchronization to overcome the artifact's power. The air was filled with the sound of their heavy breathing and the rhythmic clashing of their blades against Starrick's unnatural strength. It was a dance of two spirits against a man who had forgotten what it meant to be human. They fought across the chamber, the air vibrating with the release of the precursor energy. Every time they struck, the shroud pulsed, the air humming with a sound like a distant choir. Jacob used his brute strength to pin Starrick's arms, while Evie looked for a weakness in the artifact's connection to the vault. The air was hot and dry, making every breath a struggle against the static charge. They finally managed to tear the shroud from Starrick's shoulders, the air screaming as the connection was severed. The golden light vanished, replaced by the cool, blue glow of the vault. Starrick fell, his body finally succumbing to the exhaustion of the struggle. The air in the chamber became silent and heavy with the weight of the end of an era. As Starrick died, he spoke not of the Templars, but of the city he had tried to build, his voice a fatting whisper in the still air of the vault. Jacob and Evie stood together, their breath coming in ragged gashes, the air around them smelling of ozone and sweat. They had won the war for London, but they felt a deep, hollow fatigue. They replaced the shroud on its pedestal, the air in the chamber returning to its steady, rhythmic hum. They knew that the artifact was too dangerous for the world above, a secret that had to remain buried beneath the stone. They climbed back to the palace, the air of the upper halls feeling strangely light and empty after the intensity of the vault. They emerged into the ballroom just as the sun began to rise, the air turning a pale, watery gray through the high windows. The guests were beginning to leave, unaware of the battle that had taken place beneath their feet. Jacob and Evie stood on a balcony overlooking the royal gardens, the air fresh and smelling of the morning mist. They saw the city of London waking up, the smoke of the factories starting to rise into the sky. The air felt different. The oppressive weight of Starrick's control was gone, replaced by a sense of uncertain but genuine freedom. They were the Frye twins, and they had given the city back to its people. The night ended with a quiet meeting with Queen Victoria in her private study. The air in the room was warm and smelled of rosewater and old books. She thanked them for their service to the crown, her voice calm and steady. She knew that they were shadows, men and women who lived in the spaces between the lines of history. The air felt respectful and still. As they left the palace, the air of Westminster was crisp and full of the sound of the morning bells. Jacob and Evie walked toward their train, the green flag of the Rooks fluttering in the distance. They were ready for whatever the new age would bring, their bond as twins the anchor in the shifting winds of the city. The year was 1888, and the air in London had changed from the hopeful mist of the twins' youth into a cold, heavy fog that smelled of wet soot, copper, and the rank scent of the overcrowded slums. Jacob and Evie Frye were no longer the impulsive shadows of 20 years ago. Their movements were now measured, and their faces marked by the weight of a city that never stopped growing. The air in Whitechapel was particularly foul, thick with the smell of cheap gin and the terror of a new kind of darkness. A series of brutal murders had paralyzed the district, the air vibrating with the name Jack the Ripper. This killer was unlike the Templars they had fought before. He was a phantom of chaos who moved through the fog with a surgical precision that suggested he had once been one of their own. Jacob had been the primary guardian of Whitechapel for years, but the air around him had grown stagnant with frustration. He had disappeared while tracking the killer into the heart of the East End, leaving behind only the scent of a struggle and a discarded brass knuckle. Evie returned from India to a city that felt like a stranger. The air in the Rook's headquarters was filled with the smell of stale tobacco and the quiet, fearful whispers of men who had lost their leader. She stood in the center of the room, the air cold and still. She knew that to find Jacob and stop the Ripper, she would have to navigate a London that had become even more dangerous, than the one Crawford Starrick had ruled. Evie's investigation took her to the site of the latest murder near Mitre Square. The air there was stagnant and smelled of iron and the damp brick of the surrounding walls. She used her eagle vision to scan the cobblestones, the air seemingly shimmering with the echoes of the violence that had occurred. She found a message carved into the wood of a nearby door, a distorted version of the Assassin's Creed. The air felt thin and sharp as she realized the Ripper was using their own techniques against the innocent. She felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night wind. The killer was mocking the Brotherhood, turning the air of the city into a weapon of psychological warfare. She followed the trail to a derelict asylum on the outskirts of the district, where the air was thick with the smell of rotting floorboards and the sharp, chemical tang of old medicine. The building was a maze of shadows and broken glass, the air filled with the distant, rhythmic scratching of rats. Evie moved through the corridors, her hidden blade extended, the air whistling through the gaps in the boarded-up windows. She found evidence that Jacob had been kept there, the air in the padded cell smelling of his leather coat and the metallic scent of his blood. The Ripper was not just killing. He was breaking the spirit of the assassins, one room at a time. While searching the asylum, Evie was ambushed by a group of the Ripper's followers, men who had been twisted by the killer's madness. The air in the room was suddenly filled with the sound of their ragged breathing and the clattering of their rusted cleavers. Evie didn't fight with the simple strength of her youth. She used a new technique she had learned in India, non-lethal pressure points that left the men gasping for air. She moved with a silent, fluid grace, the air barely stirred by her presence. She needed answers, not more bodies. The air in the room grew quiet as the last of the attackers fell, the only sound the dripping of water from the ceiling. One of the men whispered that the Ripper was taking Jacob to the heart of the city, to a place where the air was loudest. Evie realized he meant the great clock tower of the Houses of Parliament. The air in the city was turning colder as a storm approached, the scent of rain and lightning filling the night. She raced across the rooftops, the air rushing past her face as she used the rope launcher to leap over the wide avenues. London was a blur of gaslight and grey stone below her. She felt a desperate urgency, the air in her lungs burning with every breath. She had to reach the tower before the Ripper completed his final act of theater. She reached the clock face just as the bell began to toll for midnight. The air in the high tower was wild with the wind and the deafening, rhythmic vibrations of the massive machinery. She found Jacob tied to the great iron gears, his face pale in the flickering light of a nearby lantern. The Ripper stood before him, his face hidden by a heavy leather mask that smelled of old blood and the ozone of the storm. The air between them was a tense, vibrating silence. The Ripper spoke in a distorted voice, claiming that the assassins were the true cause of the city's misery. Evie didn't argue, she moved. The fight inside the clock tower was a struggle of timing and precision. The air was filled with with the grinding of the brass gears and the shrieking of the wind through the louvers. The Ripper was fast, his movements a jagged, unpredictable mimicry of the assassin style. Evie used the environment to her advantage, the air ringing as her blade struck the iron supports. She managed to cut Jacob free. The air in the tower suddenly filled with the sound of the storm breaking outside. Together, the twins faced the phantom, their movements once again a perfect, synchronized balance. The air was hot from the friction of the clock's movement, making every motion feel heavy. They drove the Ripper toward the edge of the tower, the air screaming as a bolt of lightning struck the lightning rod above. In the sudden, blinding flash, the killer's mask was torn away. He was a former initiate Jacob had trained, a man whose mind had fractured under the weight of the city's darkness. The air was silent for a moment as the man looked at the city below. Then he stepped back into the void. The air swallowed his final cry, leaving only the sound of the rain against the stone. Jacob and Evie stood together, the air in the tower cold and fresh as the storm began to wash the soot from the London streets. They returned to the Whitechapel sanctuary as the sun began to rise, the air turning a pale, watery blue. Jacob was battered but alive, the air around him smelling of the medicinal herbs Evie used to treat his wounds. They knew that while the Ripper was gone, the shadows he had created would remain for a long time. The air of London was a complicated, ever-changing thing. But as long as the twins stood together, there was a chance for the light to return. They watched the city wake up, the air filling with the sound of the morning bells. A constant, rhythmic reminder that their watch was never truly over. The year was 1910, and the air in the gardens of the Crawley estate was soft, smelling of lavender, damp earth, and the faint, sweet scent of ripening apples. Jacob and Evie Frye sat on a stone bench, the air around them quiet and still. They were old now, their hair the color of the winter fog they had once used as a shroud. Jacob leaned on a cane carved from English oak, the air in his lungs slow and steady. Evie held a small leather book, its pages smelling of the cedar chest where it had been kept for decades. They looked out at the countryside, the air free of the heavy soot and iron scent of the London they had conquered. They had lived to see the transition from steam to electricity, and the air of the new century felt thin and fast compared to the heavy pulse of the Victorian age. They spoke in low voices about the legacy they were leaving behind. The air was filled with the sound of a distant motorcar, a new noise that signaled the end of the world they knew. Evie had spent her final active years ensuring that the precursor artifacts were hidden so deeply that the air of the world would not vibrate with their power for a long time. Jacob had watched the Rooks evolve from a street gang into a legitimate social movement that fought for the rights of the workers in the halls of government. The air in the garden felt balanced, a sense of closure settling over them like the evening mist. They knew that their story was moving into the realm of whispers and hidden files. The scene shifted through time to the year 1940, air in London was once again thick with smoke, but this time it was the acrid, terrifying scent of the Blitz. High explosive bombs tore through the air, and the smell of burning rubble and broken gas lines filled the streets. A young woman named Evie Frye, the granddaughter of Jacob, moved through the ruins of a collapsed building near the Tower of London. The air was hot and dry from the fires, making every breath a struggle against the dust. She was searching for a secret archive that the twins had mentioned in their final letters. She found a hidden compartment behind a scorched fireplace, the air inside smelling of old parchment and the dry, cold scent of the past. Inside the compartment was the original master map of the London ley lines and a letter written in Evie's elegant, steady hand. The air in the cellar grew still as Lydia read the words. The letter spoke of a hidden sanctuary beneath the city that was designed to protect the people during the darkest times. The air around the map seemed to glow with a faint amber light, a remnant of the precursor energy the twins had spent their lives studying. Lydia realized that the fight for London was never truly over. It just changed its face. The air of the 19th century had been about industry and greed, while the air of the 20th was about survival and freedom. Lydia used the map to navigate the tunnels beneath the city while the sirens wailed above. The air in the deep passages was cool and smelled of damp limestone and the steady, rhythmic breath of the earth. She found the sanctuary, a vast stone chamber that the twins had reinforced with modern iron supports during their later years. The air inside was fresh and pure, filtered by a precursor ventilation system that defied the smoke of the surface. She led hundreds of people into the shelter, the air filling with their quiet sobs of relief and the scent of damp wool. The legacy of the Frye twins was not just a list of dead Templars, but a physical space where life could endure. The final secret of the twins was a small gold locket hidden within the sanctuary's altar. Lydia opened it, the air in the chamber turning sweet with the scent of dried rose petals. Inside were 2 photographs, one of Jacob and Evie as children in Crawley, and one of them as old masters in the garden. The air felt heavy with the love and the bond that had sustained them through the fog and the fire. They had been the 2 halves of a single soul, a balance of action and thought that had kept the city from falling into the abyss. Lydia felt a sense of pride as she closed the locket, the air around her full of the quiet strength of her ancestors. The war eventually ended, and the air of London slowly cleared of the smoke and the fear. The sanctuary remained a secret, a hidden heartbeat beneath the rebuilding city. The story of Jacob and Evie Frye was recorded in a new volume of the Brotherhood's history, titled The Twin Chronicles. The air in the modern archives was quiet as the book was placed on the shelf, the scent of the ink and the paper a grounding force. The world moved into the age of computers and satellites, but the air of the streets still carried the echoes of the green flag and the shadow of the eagle. The final resting place of the twins was a quiet churchyard in the countryside, the air there always smelling of the blooming lavender they had loved. There were no grand monuments, just two simple stones that stood side by side. The air around the graves was peaceful, carrying the sound of the wind through the ancient yew trees. People walked past without knowing that the freedom they enjoyed was a gift from the two people resting beneath the grass. The air was full of the quiet, invisible work of the assassins, a flame that had been passed from generation to generation since the days of the iron and the steam. The air of London was a living thing, always changing and always remembering. It carried the smell of the river, the soot of the history, and the hope of the future. Jacob and Evie Frye had left their mark on every street and every stone. They had shown that even in the heart of a machine-driven world, the human spirit could not be crushed. The air was clear, the stars were bright, and the story of the Syndicate was finally complete. The watch had stopped, but the time they had fought for continued to move forward, a steady current in the sea of history. The wind blew through the empty streets of the city at night, carrying the faint, metallic scent of a hidden blade and the soft, rhythmic ticking of a gold watch. The shadows were no longer a place of fear, but a place of protection. The Frye twins had found their rest, but their London remained, a testament to the power of two spirits working as one. The air was still, and the city was dreaming of a peace that had been won in the dark.